I'm particularly excited about this panel because I found a report called Prayers Unanswered a number of years ago. And I didn't know who Amy Hawthorne was, but I thought, gosh, this is a really good report. And essentially, the report was looking at how the 2016 church law had been implemented in Egypt. And it was really the only thing that I found that so clearly documented all the different issues with that law. And so just kind of to set the stage for this discussion, as was mentioned earlier today, the system for granting approvals to build churches or to repair churches was changed in 2016 by this law. And it was received with great fanfare, I would say, by the State Department, by the USERF, but there were many organizations, including Coptic Solidarity, POMED, a lot of other organizations, POMED, who said, wait a minute, this is inherently discriminatory. If we set this precedent, we're basically making discrimination legal by a new law. So that's the backdrop for this conversation. And so I want to start with Amy. Can you explain like a little bit more in depth? I mean, I gave like an overview about why this church law is discriminatory, and what does that convey to the Egyptian society?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lindsay, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Coptic Solidarity so much for inviting me to speak here today. Coptic Solidarity, and in particular, Lindsay, has been a valued colleague, interlocutor, partner for many years, but this is the first time we've ever met in person, although we've exchanged so many emails over the years. So I'm really so pleased and honored to be here today to talk about this subject, which is so important. You know, when we think about the situation of Copts and others of the Christian faith in Egypt, and the discrimination and inequality and persecution that they face, there's so many dimensions to that. The last panel I thought was fascinating in highlighting something that is incredibly important, but isn't often discussed enough here. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this research for this report, which we published almost 4 years ago, is because to me, when we think about freedom of religion, the place of worship is one of the most important aspects of that freedom and that right. When we think about the ability of people of faith, of Christians in Egypt, for example, to be able to come together and gather with their fellow compatriots together and to worship together, this to me is one of the most important aspects of what should be religious freedom for Christians in Egypt, unfortunately, is not. And so that's why I think this church construction law of 2016, although it sounds kind of like a dry topic maybe to people here, it's so, so, so important to Christians in Egypt. And of course, all of you know this very well. So we wanted to do this report pretty much exactly for the reason that Lindsay alluded to, which is that when it was enacted by the Egyptian government and signed by President Sisi in 2016, it got so much favorable media coverage, press coverage, attention here in Washington. And there was a narrative kind of building, and I do think the Egyptian government, of course, was putting out this narrative that this is this huge breakthrough, and basically with the passage of this law, problem solved. So we wanted in our research to look at a couple of things. First of all, what does this law actually say? In what ways is it an improvement on the previous legal structure? And in what ways does it still fall short? And secondly, we wanted to look at how has it been implemented. So we looked at kind of the first year plus, and we did so much research, and Lindsay really helped us with this, and other colleagues as well, to actually try to get reliable data on how many previously unlicensed churches had been approved under this new law, and how many renovations, repairs, and the construction of new churches had been passed. Now, at that time, the results were really paltry. Some of the categories that we looked at of all these different dimensions of church construction, the numbers were less than when compared to under the Mubarak regime. Now, I do want to say that that was 4 years ago. And so in the past 4 years, of course, there have been more unlicensed churches approved. There have been more approvals granted by the Egyptian government for renovation and addition and the building of new churches. But in my opinion, the numbers still fall short. And as Lindsay said, we also really wanted to highlight in this report and the work and meetings and advocacy that we did around it, just as Lindsay said, this is a fundamentally discriminatory law because it creates a different process, an entirely different process of approval and oversight for churches than it does for mosques. And when you really delve into the details, and I think all of you here today know this better than I do, there's such a discrepancy in both the formal legal and informal systems of approval and oversight between churches and mosques. And so what we wanted to do with this report was counter the narrative that with this new law, the problem was solved and everything was great. We wanted to give credit to the Egyptian government for the improvements in the new law, the things that genuinely were better and represented progress compared to the previous legal framework. But we also wanted to make a very clear statement that this law is insufficient and it just represents a step in the right direction, but far short of what is needed. So that was sort of our goal in writing it.
So Hulda and I have had a chance to work together a few times, and she organized an amazing walk between different embassies back in June, going to different embassies to talk about blasphemy laws and people who are imprisoned in each of those countries. That was the last time we got to see each other, and she coordinated a number of amazing events there, as well as does a lot of work at the UN. So that's kind of how we know each other, and I appreciate you coming as well, Hulda. One thing I just want to touch on it with the church laws. This was talked about this morning, but we may have people who weren't here earlier. With the implementation, where we're at now, just a really quick recap. When the 2016 law was passed, over 5,000 churches and church-related facilities applied for approval. As of now, the latest numbers is that about 43%, I believe, have received approvals, but those are preliminary approvals. So what that essentially means is these churches are still required to do things to get a final approval, such as maybe an expensive repair. So when we look at the numbers, it's minuscule in terms of these actual approvals. The other factor is the new church construction, as we understand it, is happening only in new build areas, like the new Capitol, as opposed to in the rural areas or in other towns that don't have a church at all. So what does that say? That, new churches are only for people who are wealthy enough to live in the Capitol? Okay, so that's just a recap, kind of where we're at this point. But Hulda, my question for you is, what do you think is the result of passing a separate law for Christians? What are the repercussions in society with the message that sends?
I think like what you said at the beginning, it's discriminatory from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And already Christians are treated as a minority in the country and as second-class citizens. So you're making them fight for a basic human right that shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a discussion that you should have a place of worship, but you're creating a different, separate system. And you've seen this in actually numerous countries, OIC countries who are part of the Islamic cooperation. So I don't think it's not by chance that this law is there. It's that you see similar rulings where you have to get permission from the local area. You need to report how many Christians there are in your area before you can build a church or before you can have permission. And this just opens up the door for already society who's already a bit negative to, or for at least gives the microphone to Islamists who maybe don't want a Christian presence in that area. Sorry, and yeah.
Kind of what message is given to society through that? Like, what is the impact on a society when they know that they don't have the same basic rights? And I should expand that it's not just Christians. It's Baha'i who are outlawed. They're not even allowed to have a house of worship. Shia who struggle incredibly to have any type of public worship as well. And Jehovah's Witnesses are also banned. Yeah.
Yeah, so like what I said, it's putting that out from the beginning. And actually it's interesting that actually the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief and the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Rights in 2016 actually sent a communication about this directly when the law came into place and citing why it was discriminatory. And I see here that actually the Egyptian government has not responded to their communication. And the communications that they have, and they've responded to very, very few communications that they've gotten. And the ones that they have responded to are the ones that received a press release in conjunction with the communication. So I think a follow-up would be to do another one now and ask them, they haven't responded, and how, and I think reciting this report and actually looking at which countries have and haven't implemented it. And then I just wanted to cite, because of Article 18 has very clearly that you have the right to a place of worship. And then, of course, which is different, I think, to the US religious freedom, is that there's like but when it violates public morals, or you can make a limitation. And obviously then the states will say, well, we're protecting public morals, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really, with blasphemy laws as well, you're like, oh, okay, public morals, okay, we gotta, we can't do this. But it's very clear, and the Human Rights Committee has put out how you should interpret it. And for the first of all, it shouldn't be discriminatory. So you already have that, where you have a law for churches or non-Muslim worship, very different to that of Muslims. And I mean, if you go to any mosque in Egypt, there's several that are not looking to, if you think about safety standards, that really do not follow those, that level. So we want safe churches, safe places of worship, but to have a different law, and then also, I think, not even just a different law, but putting these criteria that you mentioned in your report, where you have to legitimize why you want a church. And then finally, I just wanted to raise with why they can't argue that it's for public morals and so on. It has to based on principles not deriving exclusively from a single tradition. So in Christianity or in Baha'i, you should have a right to worship. Everyone should have a right to worship, and it doesn't matter what religion it is. So saying that, because our tradition here is that we only want the Islamic faith or our interpretation of Islam, that's not a valid argument, because everyone should have. It's not. So in this example, I think they would be thinking about, for example, in the case that we just heard in the last session about where girls are forcibly abducted. So you can't use religious freedom to exploit a child, or so that's right. And that's in all traditions, right? Right. But to worship, that's definitely not something you can limit.
Right. Yeah, thank you. It's helpful that you do a lot of work with the UN, because you bring in a side to this conversation that for some of us who aren't as active there, we're not as up to speed, at least I am not. So going back to Amy, how do the requirements of the 2016 law compare to requirements that govern the building of other houses of worship? And with that, I should say, in the Egyptian constitution, it says that the three heavenly religions are allowed. So from the get-go in the constitution, we've already eliminated everything but Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Yeah. So in law and in practice, it is not hard and much easier to build and repair a mosque in Egypt than it is to build or repair a church. And so I'm just going to focus my remarks on the situation for Christians in Egypt, because I'm not as familiar with the situation for houses of worship with other faith groups, although Lindsay mentioned the Baha'i community and how much difficulty they face. So when it comes to building or repairing a mosque, there are legal requirements that people have to follow, but I just want to read you a quote from a report that was published several years ago by the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, a very well-respected Egyptian human rights group. And it's titled Permission to Pray, the Houses of Worship Crisis in Egypt. And the report quotes a Ministry of Endowments official in the Egyptian government saying, quote, "The Egyptian state does not and cannot prevent the construction of any mosque or interfere in its licensing by local authorities, regardless of the stated restrictions and rules, because this is impossible, and the state is incapable of restricting Islamic religious rights." So that is not the case when it comes to churches. The situation is completely different. The legal framework, as we discussed, is different, and there is and this has been the case for a long time in Egypt, but one of the things that was codified in the 2016 church construction law is that security agencies have a formal role in reviewing applications of what we would call informal or unlicensed churches that were seeking to become legalized. Of course, we know security agencies in Egypt have always played a big role in this because, to be very frank, in my view, the Egyptian state treats the Christian community and in particular churches as a security issue, not as a human rights issue. So first and foremost, this is addressed and managed and regulated by the Egyptian state as a security issue. So one of the things about the new law, the 2016 law, is it does formally list intelligence security agencies as having a role in approving which churches should be legalized. As I said, this was already happening, but the fact that this is now in the law, I see as a step backwards. It formalizes and legalizes the role of those security agencies, which are looking to this issue through the lens of, will allowing this church to be built, expanded, or repaired inflame the local community of Muslims? It is not the first, second, third, or maybe even any question that's asked is, what does this Christian community need? What do they need to be able to have the facilities for them to worship? That's not either taken into consideration at all by the authorities, or it's a very, very low priority requirement. The number one question is, will building or repairing or adding on to this church inflame or disturb the local Muslim community? Of course, there's no such question asked about building mosques. So even in the law itself, it says that any church that is approved to be built should, quote, be proportional to the size and needs of the community that it serves, end quote. Well, who determines that? Who decides? What does this even mean? Why is it the state's role, the authorities' role, to decide what size a church should be, or what is needed for that community, or how big an addition should be? So that rule right there, which is stated clearly in the law, is kind of the hook, I think, that is given to allow the authorities to say, this community that you want to build or expand a church in, the size is too big based on what we think the needs are. So I also wanted to go back to something that was mentioned before, which is really interesting, which is that with the new cities that are being built in Egypt under the government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, including the new administrative capital outside of Cairo, but not limited to that, Sisi has announced that in each of these new communities, for every mosque that is constructed, a church will be constructed. Now, I think we would here all agree that that's a good thing. That is a step in the right direction. But to me, that is a little bit of a public relations move in the sense that where the real needs are for building and repairing and expanding churches in Egypt is where there is already a significant Christian community. And of course, we know that that community lives throughout the country of Egypt, but there are parts of the country, as we know, where there's a larger Christian population. And that's where there should be a liberalized regime of building and constructing churches. A lot of Egyptians are not necessarily going to want to or have the ability or finances to move to one of these new cities, which are out in the desert. The new administrative capital, which is being built at a cost of $58 billion or something, has a beautiful new cathedral, and that's great. But how many Egyptians are going to be able to access that and pray and worship there? Will they even be, how many people, ordinary people, will be allowed into this new city? So while those things are not, they're positive as far as they go, they're a distraction, in my view, from the core issue, which is that by law and by practice, Christians are treated as second-class citizens when it comes to their places of worship. And yes, with this new law, the process of getting approvals has been streamlined. That's a good thing. And yes, there has been this committee to approve the legalization of unlicensed churches. And by the way, why were there so many unlicensed churches even applying to get legal status? Because they couldn't get approval from the authorities. That's the first thing. Why are there, 5,000?
You know the members of this committee. This is the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister,
Right.
the military.
That's such an important point. How can these people, exactly, how can these people, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior, how do they possibly have time to review thousands of applications? But in addition to that, sir, why does the Ministry of Defense, if we just step back and ask this question, have any role in churches? Only if it is understood by the state as a security issue, and that the activities of Christians and other religious minorities in Egypt are seen by the state as something to be controlled and regulated so that it doesn't inflame or provoke Muslim compatriots. So yes, there's still so many problems with this new law, even with the improvements that it does represent.
Those are so many great points. I'm nodding over here, especially about the Copts being considered as a security concern. Moving back to Hulda, one of my questions is, with regard to, I believe it was the State Department report this year, the IRF report on Egypt, that mentioned that the religious leaders in Egypt are pleased with the level of progress of church approvals. And a quick backup here, we now know that the head of the Protestant churches in Egypt, Reverend Zaki, had filed FARA registration to serve as a foreign agent for the Egyptian government, and regularly comes here and has meetings with members of Congress, with the State Department, etc. So kind of with that news that was coming out recently, it starts to make sense that maybe somebody who's registered as a foreign agent may have a positive take on the speed of approvals. Are there any other reasons, any other factors? Like, why do you think that the church leaders have been so silent on the issue? And also, you're getting my perspective and Amy's, but do you have a different perspective on the implementation? Do you see it as more positive than us or negative, or how do you see it impacting, I guess you could say, the lives of Copts?
All right. So, yeah, I mean, the silence of leaders is not uncommon when it comes to religious persecution, because they have churches and they're trying to keep, and they have a relationship with the state and they don't want to tread on any toes. And I know previous Archbishop Nazila Ali has mentioned that when leaders come to countries, they really have to listen widely, because the leaders of churches, they have another, or of place of worship, they have another role. You should speak with the people, congregants, or even move outside of the cities, because like we heard, and I know most of the issues have been in Al-Minya, and Cairo as well, but there's a difference between the Cairo and the rest of Egypt. I mean, there are certain differences, and that needs to, and I also, when governments make visits, I don't think they go to Al-Minya. It's like they go to Cairo and that's it.
The new church.
Yeah, and they go to the new church, exactly.
Beautiful cathedral.
So that's a problem. So that so access is a problem to get to all the leaders, and then of course the big leaders that they do meet with have a difficult role as well. I don't always think that it's I don't know, maybe but I think it's also like they want to try and keep they don't want to lose their building. They have other interests as well that they have to. So that's why. And with regards to the law, no, in Jubilee Campaign's Universal Periodic Review report, we did raise concerns with the law, and that it wasn't being, with the low numbers of buildings that were given, that were given the okay. So we also mentioned that there were church leaders who were concerned with the criteria placed. And I think if you talk with individual pastors, there is concerns with that, because they're from that area, and that it depends on the people, the number and the need, just like what you said. So that's definitely, and then of course the repercussions, which is, now I think something happened with this, but
maybe we can speak loud enough without it.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear us okay?
No, so I think that's one of the reasons. They don't want to lose what they have. But, yeah.
Maybe the battery died, I'm not sure.
I hope it didn't press something.
It's working.
Oh, okay, it's working.
It's working. Okay. And just another follow-up on something you had mentioned earlier, Hulda, in terms of how the law relates to other countries. You said that you see some of these similar patterns.
Yeah.
Well, could you expand on that a little bit about the trends that you're seeing in the region? Because I know you don't just cover Egypt.
Yeah. So I think one country which also ADF International works a lot on is Algeria. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you mentioned that about security concern, that Copts and Christians are seen as a security concern. The same in Algeria. And also they also use that pretext, health and safety, but then you have the military at the door. So it's all in an effort to intimidate the population and to shut down. And they've shut down churches on these grounds. Then also in Indonesia, in the UPR that we drafted for that, again, also they've been waiting for years to get their registration. And then in Sudan, we were really happy with, after the revolution, it was looking really promising. But then again, also that somehow it slips in, they're not able to, there was a specific law for non-Muslim worship. And again, that same criteria. And so very early, because I was quite positive, I was super happy about the repeal of the apostasy law in Sudan. That was huge. But then again, they have to do this separate, like, for Muslim houses of worship, there's this law, and then for non-Muslim houses of worship. And then again, there's that person, you have to get permission from the governor. You need to know that there's a need for a church. And if you had a wonderful society where everyone's happy to have another church, then you don't have it, that's not an issue. Or if you have a good governor who believes in freedom of religion and belief. But if you're in a society where there's a lot of animosity, or they don't want, then then the right to freedom of religion and belief, which Egypt has ratified with the ICCPR in January, but also is a right for everyone, then that gets restricted from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think also with the ICCPR and some of the international documents that Egypt has signed, it's always done with, what's the word? Reservation, thank you. It's done with the reservation that it be consistent with Sharia law, which basically undermines the whole purpose of signing that document. Mm-hmm. So as a follow-up to that, it sounds like we're mostly on the same page. Amy, what would you recommend as an alternative to this 2016 church law? And I know there's a difference between what we would like to see and maybe what's a practical next step, but how would you describe a better solution for the situation?
Well, I will associate myself very closely with those in Egypt who have been calling for a very long time for a unified houses of worship law. One law that applies the same criteria and rules for all houses of worship to be built, repaired. And again, let's focus just on this repair issue. The levels of bureaucracy that churches have to go through to get approval just to do sometimes very simple repairs is mind-boggling. And sometimes many times they don't get that approval. So a system that applies the same, this is the dream, this is in theory, to make Egypt truly a place where all citizens are equal. It would need to be a unified houses of worship law that applies the same criteria, rules, process to approve and regulate all houses of worship, no matter which faith group they pertain to. In reality, I do think that the politics of that, Egypt is not there yet. I think that that's something that everyone who supports this cause should be aspiring to and working towards. But in the political reality of Egypt today, I don't see that as something that will happen anytime soon, unfortunately, in my view. And in the past, when Egyptian civil society groups and even some members of parliament and other people in officialdom have sort of tried to endorse or push forward this issue of a unified houses of worship law, it has met with a lot of resistance and opposition and controversy. So I don't think that in the current political climate that is possible. And I'll say something now that maybe is going to be controversial with some of our audience, but I think President Sisi sees his role as the protector of Egypt's Christian community. And while that role has certain advantages to it, it's certainly better to have a president of Egypt who wants to protect this community rather than harm it or drive it away. It still represents this age-old attitude of a community that is protected and in that view is subordinate and not equal and not seen as full citizens. So I think when it comes to just going back to this law, which is the kind of focal point of our panel, when the Egyptian government and its supporters, they've come to Washington and they've done a lot of public relations around this law to say that this is a huge human rights breakthrough for Egypt and we're doing such a great job on this issue. And so what they will do is they'll provide, and I've even seen like a fact sheet and a graphic that I think the embassy put out that was sort of impressive. You know, it had all these facts and figures about all the churches that had been legalized and all the churches that had been, repairs approved. Great. But what we wanted to do with this report and what Coptic Solidarity and many other groups are always trying to push the bigger picture, which is, yes, this does represent progress, but it is so inadequate because if you step back and look at the bigger picture, you still see a discriminatory and very slow and very security-dominated process for approving these churches. So we have tried in our own small way, my organization, just to provide facts into the conversation to make people more aware of the whole picture and not just end the conversation by saying, this is a great new law, Sisi's doing an amazing job on this issue, end of story, because it really is not adequate. It represents a step forward in some ways, but a small step forward that is far from adequate.
Yeah, it needs to be kept in perspective, which is what I hear you saying. And in regard to that, lobbying document that the Egyptian embassy put out here all around DC, they put a lot of effort and money into their PR campaign, and Coptic Solidarity actually published a fact check of that. So we have a side-by-side explanation of every claim and then reality, or as much as we could possibly fact check. To wrap up, Hulda, I have a question for you regarding any other international mechanisms, any other advocacy ways that we can push, and when I say we, I mean NGOs, individuals, churches, whoever it is, who are interested in this issue, that they can, what are the international mechanisms or ones here in the U.S. that people can engage with to possibly push for a unified houses of worship law?
Good question. And also, just to follow up on the first panel, because it raised on blasphemous, freedom of conscience is key. And so if that falls, it just trickles down into all these things. And you see that already in the houses of worship. So I think that's also one way to push with the Egyptian, like if you don't give freedom of conscience, then this law can never be effective either. So there's several, it's interesting because Pierre Totsi with Representative Chris Smith was here, and he's active also in the OSCE, I think, at parliamentarians. Yeah. And Egypt is one of the partnering countries in that group. So there's a partner for cooperation. So there's one way maybe to push through that. And as I mentioned, they ratified the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights. Of course, they put a reservation. But one way I think that's very effective to engage, the UPR was one, and I know you were going to present, and then COVID happened, but you were still able to. That's one way. But also the Human Rights Committee is actually really a good place, because you get direct dialogue between the experts and the states. And actually I saw that Egypt had their report 2022. So it would be following up with the Human Rights Committee on that is one way. And then, of course, here, I think in the state side, you are the expert on that. But I think, like what Congressman, the representative with Congressman Smith said, the staffer, to get people to go to their respective offices and to knock on their doors. And I wanted to raise one recommendation, because one thing that we didn't mention maybe, but it's in the report, and we also mentioned in the UPR, is the it was good you raised this issue, because I'm also like, it does sound like a dry topic, but it's really, really important, because this is also one of the reasons why people are arrested. So they don't have a way to appeal. There was an Amnesty International actually reported on a group who were protesting that they didn't get registration, they were arrested, because they can't appeal, and then they were arrested for that. So granting people the right to worship also gives them freedom to worship. I mean, and also stops arbitrary arrest. So getting that legal status is really, really important, not only for them, but also for the community. And one recommendation to the Egyptian government would be, if there is a protest like that in an area, instead of, putting them, arresting, putting the people who are protesting in prison, is to give straight away registration to that church. If you protest, because now you're rewarding the people who are violent, or the ones who, when the mobs come and say this church can't be built here, you're rewarding it when you suddenly stop the building, or you stop or prolong the whole registration process. So then they should say any attacks on a church, because I think Sisi wants to kind of portray himself as positive to Christianity, or to Christians. So one way would be to, if there is an attack, straight away register that church. That's one way.
Absolutely, what Hulda said is so important, and we haven't even gotten into this conversation, and this is a topic for the next conference, about the almost total impunity, lack of justice and punishment for those who not attack Christians in general in Egypt, but attack churches and try to obstruct worship, obstruct the building or repair of a church. I've said this many times in my conversations with people who have a different view than I do on the current Egyptian government. If Sisi really wanted to show that things are different, he could send a very strong signal that there will be no leniency and there will be trials and, if convicted, punishment for people who attack churches and attack Christians, instead of continuing this, informal state security-run negotiation system that is currently used to settle these problems. So I await and welcome the day when President Sisi himself says this is not acceptable and anyone who does this is going to be punished under law. We have not seen that happen. So even when a church does finally get approval to operate and for repairs, who is that church really going to be secure and protected? And if people do attack it, will they be brought to justice? I mean, huge problems that still remain, really serious today in Egypt. So.
And I guess maybe the ratification of the ICCPR is 14th of January. So maybe that's a way to kind of say, how have they been following through on this? They've received all these UN communications. They've only responded to 2. Something like that.
Okay, that's definitely a conversation we need to continue. Sounds like we could partner on that. Just in closing, this issue of impunity, it's with every type of crime against Copts in Egypt, but just to follow up on what Amy said, we're getting a few new approvals in these areas of new construction, but we never get the number of how many churches are being closed, or very rarely. And at some point, I'm wondering if that number of the churches being closed because mobs go and protest, is that number almost equal to the number of new approvals? And then in August, within a period of about a little less than 2 weeks, 11 churches were burned. What happened with that? No one was held accountable. It was, they said it was electrical issues or whatever. So it's definitely a topic that we need to continue working on. But I really appreciate both of you coming, sharing your ideas, your expertise. And I think that's it.
Thank you.